from what we have covered so far, we can at least come to this conclusion that yes, theism trumps over all of its alternative. And this is something we can very well establish via a number of different arguments. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to Incisive Thoughts, and we are back with the GORAPS series, with the 4th episode of GORAPS series. Inshallah, it's our goal here to actually conclude with the God's existence part, inshallah, hopefully. And I introduce my brother Yusuf Ponder again back on this channel. Thank you for coming again. And yeah, you can start with, where we left off, or maybe give a brief summary of what we have covered so far.
Yes, if you could just share my screen again.
Sure.
So we've got this little mind map thing we've been developing. So essentially we're doing GORAP, and GORAP is an acronym. We're talking about how do you come to the conclusion Islam is true. And GORAP is a method of sort of establishing that. And there's 5 major points. Oh, well, we changed it to GORAPS, didn't we? So it adds the little extra element at the end. But the first one, G, is God's existence. So this is a discussion about whether or not God exists, and if he does, what kind of God exists, etc. Oneness is about Tawheed versus, say, Trinitarianism, Deism, maybe Deism is more to do with the first one, like what kind of God exists. But it's, monotheism versus tritheism versus polytheism, that kind of thing. So like how many gods discussion. Then R is a discussion about revelation. Is there a good case for revelation, or a inter-revelation discussion? Bible versus Quran versus X, Y, and Z. A, affirmation, which is talking about, is God worthy of worship? Why should you worship God? P, prophethood, a discussion about, is the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam a good candidate for prophethood? Are there other candidates, or and the discussion about, like, for example, you've got more modern prophets, like quote unquote prophets, like the Mormon prophet, I can't remember his name, Joseph Smith, or the other ones. You've got the development of other religions like Sikhism, and you get these guru types things. They come after the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Ahmadis, with their claim to have another prophet, etc. So there's a discussion there to be had, and we can go into it in a certain amount of detail or less detail, and there's ways of like dealing with cases. Like, for example, if there's a good case to make that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the last messenger, we don't need to go into too much detail, for example, talking about other claims to messengership afterwards. Although we can, like, there's a whole book, for example, on the Ahmadi prophet, showing contradictory claims, for example, and that's a way of sort of dealing with a very specific example. But I don't think it's necessary in this case to have to do that. You can just sort of talk about prophethood, make a case for the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the whole point of this, like our goal with this, is to simplify, while going into a decent amount of depth in each of these topics, so that if you want to sort of get to a point of certainty or clarity on the matter, inshallah, this series is going to be a way to take you through each of these steps. Now, we've focused, I think this is the 3rd episode. We did an introductory one, which I don't really count. It was sort of talking about what we're going to do. And then in the first 2 episodes, we went into arguments for a necessary being or an independent being. And this is essentially this, which is like a sort of a thought path. So we've asked a question about God's existence, and we've mentioned different arguments you could make for God's existence. We focus on a particular one, so the argument from dependency. And then this went through this sort of line of questioning where it's like there's different options. We're exploring the different options. Long story short, we come to the conclusion that a necessary independent being must exist, that must be distinct from creation, and that it's unique in the way that it exists. It's not like us. It's not like me and you and the things we have around us, in any way, shape, or form. It's very unique. And so we then ask, okay, so we've come to a conclusion that there's a type of being that has certain attributes. What other attributes can we say that this thing has? So does the necessary being have other attributes? In the episode that came after that, we discussed a couple of them, or in the last one. So we discussed an argument for knowledge. So we went over, for example, the design argument, talking about purpose, function, and meaning within the universe, and how that shows that this necessary being, that which we are all dependent upon, must have knowledge, must have wisdom, that it is creating things with meaning, with a function, with a purpose. We also talked, and yeah, so this sort of made a case for these two attributes, and we also connected it. You can see here, there's a few more lines. We said that this is also an argument for life, because if it's got and also awareness, or we said consciousness, but that's a controversial word. So this idea that it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is aware of his creation, like he is aware of the things that he's dealing with, the things that he is sustaining, the things that he is creating, and that the fact that things have purpose and function is a sign of that. Like he's creating things with purpose, with a goal in mind. And so we explored that, and we're showing how these arguments show that the necessary being must have these other attributes as well. And we also went into power, the source of all power argument, and it, like everything that's contingent has non-zero levels of power. If you imagine the Dragon Ball Z thing, and we had a little thing on our eye, it's like, this is level 1 power. This is everything has some amount of power. Yeah.
Yeah.
And if everything has some level of power and it is dependent upon the necessary being, or on the independent being, that power must have originated in that, and that it's something that we have been bestowed with from that. And so we had a discussion about that we could talk about in terms of being the source of all power. But there are other things that we would talk about as well. So we're sort of going to go into those now. Like, for example, we could maybe talk about, I don't know, which ones do you want to start with?
Yeah. So actually what I have in mind is that, if we try to summarize our last episode was looking at aspects within our observable reality. For example, we see purpose, we see function, we see design, we see fine tuning, we see laws of nature manifesting, or they having a coherence and consistency across the board, across all of the universe. And we could establish a few things based on that. But then, there's one more thing that we can factor in our conversation, which we can ponder about, is that our reality that we live in is not just material reality. There are things beyond that. And I just want to add something on stage, which, Joshua Rasmussen was mentioning. One of my guests, he was mentioning that there are a few things which he highlights, which we just to ponder on, and we will just touch on one aspect of it in this conversation. But just to pondering, just some kind of pondering would lead us to some conclusion. So let's say what he has to say. He says that there are 10 things which chunks of matter cannot on their own make or explain. Like, for example, logical necessities, truth itself, thoughts. You cannot have thoughts just explained in an adequate sense via chunks of matter, which includes visual images, feelings, intentions, awareness, good reasoning. Good reasoning itself cannot just be, you cannot make sense of that from a materialistic, an absolute materialistic perspective. Like, for example, when you think of two premises and then a conclusion comes in your mind, you cannot say that, okay, there are some atoms navigating that in your head. It makes no sense at all. So the reasoning itself has an immaterial nature to it, or an immaterial aspect to it. Willful action itself, the fact that you cannot just see, your free will to be some kind of machine or some kind of cell or neuron in your brain that is making all of the choices. So free will also has an aspect of, or the willful actions have an aspect which cannot be absolutely grounded in a material sense. and a sense of self itself. A sense of self that we have, that, a unified self we have, where we say, oh, I, who am, for example, I am Khalid. That cannot also be fully grounded in a materialistic sense. So on these things, I just want to get to one part in our conversation today, which is consciousness. I think if we ponder on this aspect itself, I think that itself can lead us to some conclusions about our reality, and then we would see what best explains that aspect of reality. So the fact that, for example, what we see are just arrangements or rearrangements of matter or atoms, we can say that uh, physics can tell us what the arrangement does, but not why the arrangement should be aware in itself. If I, for example, I can say that, okay, I am aware. Is it like, we can raise the question that, is this kind of awareness just because of an arrangement of atoms that is coming in, or is there something beyond that which is within me? This is where the hard problem of consciousness comes in. The hard problem of consciousness itself uh, comes with two challenges, two very big challenges. One is, what is it like for a particular organism to have phenomenal conscious experience? The fact that, for example, I have an experience or you have an experience, and you can take an example of, like, you having a chocolate ice cream on a Sunday. You can imagine that, and you can see, okay, yeah, how subjectively it feels, how it feels to you subjectively. That itself is not something that can be grounded in a materialistic sense. So there's an ontological question about its nature. What is, like, the reality of it? And then the second question with the hard problem of consciousness brings in is, why and how do phenomenal experiences arise from neurobiological processes? If they actually do arise from just neurobiological processes, how does that happen? So this is where materialists come in, and materialists try to have like at least 4 or 5 ways of they try to explain consciousness, this subjective aspect. I hope I've given an example of what consciousness is. Like, I can give another example. Like, maybe if someone is still not catching what I'm trying to say, is that, like, imagine a machine where, like, you create a robot, for example. You built a robot with incredible advanced sensors and processors. It can describe light wavelengths, respond to emotional cues, and solve abstract problems. But even if it's mimicking human behavior perfectly, does it feel anything? Does it have an inner world of its own? Which is where, like, when we ponder how we have an inner world of our own, there's a construction problem where we cannot just from a materialistic perspective construct that on for like just from atoms and molecules. There's something beyond that. And one more, like, I can actually bring one example to highlight a point. So let's say, this is one analogy, the redness detector analogy. Imagine a perfect machine detects a red light wavelengths, measures every physical property of red, knows the physics of color down to atoms. But ask the machine, what does red feel like? That is what the machine cannot answer. Why? Because physical data is public, conscious experiences is private. It's something internal.
Yeah.
Physics gives measurements.
Just to touch on this as well, like, because what does red feel like? There's a way when this question's asked. There's a way some people respond to this as if it's like this doesn't matter. Like, what's that got to do with consciousness? The thing is red, like, feeling is a part of consciousness. Yes, human beings are rational animals, but we're also artistic beings as well. And like feelings and emotions and all of these things are tied into what makes something conscious, makes something self-aware. When you watch a movie that's touching existential questions and it sits there and you sit there and it makes you feel something, the way, like, color, art, all of this plays a role in that. And when you look at red can mean multiple things depending on the context. Like, I feel covered in blood. Yeah. Like, red being everywhere. Like, if you watch like certain war films, they use the poppy. Yeah. And it's like you have this red field of poppies, and it's representative of something. It's supposed to elicit certain emotions and feelings in conscious beings that are watching and engaging with it. And then people sit there and reflect upon their own mortality or upon other grander questions, and it might make them sad or hopeful or pessimistic or all of these things, and color can elicit that. And and it was funny, I was talking to my daughter was asking me some questions, and she was like, "Dad, what's your favorite color?" And I was like, "My favorite color is green." And she's like, "What's your top 10 favorite colors?" I was like, "Well, that's like you're gonna ask me for all the colors now, essentially." But she's like, "All right, what's your top two?" And then I was thinking about my top two, and my what it used to be was green and orange. I still like orange. Yeah, still my bike is orange, for example. I've got orange here, but I've noticed as I've gotten older, I've inclined more to green and blue. I like that combination, and I'm thinking about what I like more: green and blue or green and orange. And it used to be the other way around. I didn't like blue at all when I was younger. I wouldn't incline to it. It didn't make me feel like nice about it. But when I think about myself now, I do feel like I like blue and green, and you'll notice it in my logo that my logo is blue and green, and it has this, and it's not arbitrarily so. It makes me think of beach waters, sandy waters, and lagoons, and it makes me feel of a tranquil place. And there's blue. I don't know why, but I associate blue with communication and talking, and I associate green with life and love more than I do red. Red I find to be a very aggressive color. But this is the point. The whole point of this topic now is colors make me feel things. Yeah, when I'm looking at them, when I see people that love red to me is a very aggressive color. I don't know why. It's not necessarily that it logically follows from that. It's just and for other people it means something different. Like certain women, for example, they like red and they cover everything in red because they find it to be a romantic color, because there's this association between that and how it makes them feel when they're thinking about, they're probably thinking Valentine's and they love hearts and roses, and so, and that's what they're thinking. When I think red, I don't think love hearts and roses. I think blood and anger and red in the face, and so I'm associating it to different things, and it makes me feel a certain way. And when I'm talking about that or I'm describing it, I'm not just like a robot in that I'm listing things that I myself do not feel, that I do not relate to. I'm describing things I have felt, because that's what it means to be conscious. Do you in the human sense that you feel things, you get happy, you get sad. When I think about my children, I feel love, I feel hope, I feel it's and that's just, it's bittersweet. I know they're gonna live a life, and that includes suffering and pain, and that they'll lose me one, and that might be hard for them, and they'll have their own tests and trials, and their iman will go up and down, and that's exciting and scary, and these are feelings, yeah. And there's no point talking about them in terms of objective versus subjective. That's not the point here. The point here is that is an integral part of the human experience, yeah, and of conscious experience. And the question is what, how, when, and because this is complex. We're talking about the meaning of life in some cases, how these things and the use of colors. When you think of art and the most famous pictures, if you take art seriously, art is supposed to make you feel things, and those feelings are supposed to motivate some type of thinking in you, yeah. And I'll show. Can you do me a favor? Actually, I'll search it. I'll pop it up. So I'll show you my favorite picture, by a Polish artist. Okay. So this is one of my favorite paintings. So it's made by a guy called what's his name? artist Jan Matejko, and there's a whole description, like you can read about it on Wikipedia about what the painting's about, the circumstances, and art is somewhat subjective. Now, this might seem a bit random, but just sort of stick with it for a moment. When I see this, I relate to it in a very personal way because I think about my own life. I think about my own sort of like struggles with depression, and just the difficulties of life, the stresses of life, and like if you look at the background, you have like, sorry. Yeah, so there's like a party going on in the background, and there's people laughing and dancing, and like the use of red. Yeah, like the use of red, it's very like, and I look at that, and some people, they look at parties and it makes them, like the modern Westerner, for example, who loves partying, they love drinking, they love alcohol, they love singing and dancing and rah, rah, rah. Like I look at these and it makes me anxious. Like I have no desire in me to go to parties anymore. Like my office is in the center of a town, and there's pubs and bars around me, and I have to park and walk to my office, and I have to walk past these environments. And when I look at them, when I see the people and the way they are in these places, like there's not an atom in my body that wants to join them in that. Like the thought of it makes me anxious. Like I don't want that. I don't like it. I don't like it. Makes me uncomfortable. And I'm looking at this, and it's sort of like the same thing. And the look at the colors. It's very dark. It's a dark room, but it's contrasted. There's like a bright red in the distance here. But like this is literally just blobs of color. A guy has gotten paints. And paints are just like blobs of color, and he's layered them. He's put them down on this flat thing, and he's using color, and he's arranged color in such a way to create a story in this image. And then you have this guy he's like, there's the weird contrast. He's wearing red again. It's this like this bright red suit, and he's dressed as a jester. And jesters are supposed to be the clowns, the entertaining people. But he's sad. Like he's not what you would expect. Like, and you could imagine he was in the room and he's like, hi, and he's juggling and he's being silly and he's joking and he's added to the atmosphere. He's made these people happy and laugh and forget about their own worries and so on and so forth. And then like after he's done his job, he's gone to be away. He's secluded, like he's in this room on his own, and the room is dark, and there's like light coming in through the window. It's night outside. You've got like a comet that's going on in the background, but it's like it's very like the table's scruffy. There's like scrumpled up paper. There's a story behind the paper as well, by the way, but like you don't necessarily know the story when you're just looking at the picture, and you don't need to. But like what's going on here, what's happening, and like and this is how I feel sometimes, like locked away in my office. When I'm with people, I try to make them laugh and smile and be happy, and then when I'm on my own, like I'm thinking, I'm worried about the world, and I'm worried about my family, and I'm worried about my friends, and I'm worried about all of these problems, and I'm gonna fix them, and like how to make the world and me a better place, how to please Allah, how to make sure I'm in a good standing. Like this is like, and this doesn't even have to be like, we don't need to make it analogous to like my past life as a non-Muslim, for example, when I'm thinking about parties and how I relate to them. Like the party in the background, we could use that as an analogy for many things. Like I could think about that in terms of the public YouTube scene, and that could be YouTube in the back, and all of the madness on YouTube and all of the thumbnails and things. And then there's me in a room like and I want you to ask, how do you relate to this picture when you're looking at it, and art in general? How does it make you feel? And this is it. Yeah. This is what being human is you feel things, you look at things, it makes you think. Yeah. It affects you, and it makes you contemplate certain things. And that's that's human. Now, does AI have this experience? Yeah. Does ChatGPT? Yeah. If I was to post this, how does it feel? And like, we could even possibly like do that where I could like copy and paste it over and just say like, how do you feel?
And it's most probably gonna just give a very conventional understanding of what it's known, or like what information has been feeded to it about, like, these kind of arrangements, and it's gonna just blabber that, not actually having an internal experience of what it feels like. That subjectivity is not gonna be there.
Let's see what it says. I'm sharing it again.
Yeah. Interesting.
It feels heavy, like you've walked on. Yeah, so it's describing this. And so now let's say, and so the way this thing works, it's an algorithm. Yeah, it dips into this information pool and it sorts through it, and then it's sort of like responding in a way. Yeah. So look, so I'm saying, like, how does this make you feel? And what it's doing is it's like it's dipping into this algorithm and it's being inspired in a way by how other people describe things. Yeah.
Right.
So it's talking, it feels heavy, like you've walked in on a moment you weren't meant to see. The painting gives a sense of deep exhaustion and quiet despair. Jester is supposed to be the one who brings laughter. Like the same kind of things. Like it's talking about that. But the thing is when I'm talking about this, I'm relating to it about my own experiences, about my own life, about how, like, I'm looking at this man and the emotions he's expressing, and I'm thinking about how I have felt those emotions too. I can relate to it because I feel, I get upset, I get happy, I get sad, you know what I mean? Like, I'm a complex thing in that way, and so are you, and so is everyone watching it. And when he's describing these things, it's like, well, what do you mean when you say feel? And what's his answer? When I say things like it feels heavy, I'm not describing an emotion I'm actually experiencing. I don't feel emotions the way humans do. What I'm doing is giving you an interpretive, emotional reading of the scene. And where's he getting this information from? It's getting it from the internet. Yeah, it's getting it from this pool of information where people have described their own feelings and their own paintings.
Exactly.
Borrowing from the human experience, rejiggling it, and then just pumping it out. Yeah. And now, if there wasn't, let's say there wasn't the internet and there was not, and we didn't give it human input, we didn't give it information from that pool of human creativity, what could it give us? Yeah, these things run by necessity on the information that you give them. Otherwise, like, and it's not like it's having these experiences itself. So it's saying here, so to be precise, I don't feel sadness, heaviness, empathy, or anything like that. Okay, so then it can't relate. It can't feel it anyway. It's not feeling. Yeah, and so it's not, and that is a part of consciousness, feeling, getting sad, getting angry, getting happy. It's just an algorithm. It's just pumping regurgitated things out. Yeah. And
Exactly.
and the thing is like, the weird thing about feelings is I don't know if the way you feel is like, how am I supposed to know if the way you feel is exactly the same way that I do?
Yeah, we can never know that. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, so when I'm looking at this, but like, we have an intuition that we're sharing something here. Yeah. So like, when I'm looking at this picture and I see a sad man, like I see a man overcome with worry. Yeah. I see a man that like is stuck in a world that's bigger than him. more complex than he is, and like he's got some role that he has to play. Maybe he's got a family at home and kids, a wife, and like maybe he cares about his people, his community, his society, his family, himself, like the direction it's going, how that plays into the world at large. There's all these things going on around him. Like I feel like I get it. Like I look at this painting and I feel like
I understand you.
there's no way I can rationally know. There's no way I can be absolutely like philosophically certain that we're feeling the same thing. But I don't have any doubt for some reason that we are feeling the same thing. You know what I mean? Like that when I have been depressed or sad or like I relate, I feel like yeah. And there's no way philosophically to be able to make that leap from like where I am and when I'm feeling these things, when I'm looking at this painting and like the emotions he must be feeling. But I feel like I can relate, and I feel like that's justified. It's not irrational. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
And so,
you know,
yeah, sorry. So this links to this idea of like, if you pull up the other image you had up before, the one where it's like about color, because this seems a bit like a rant, but there's a point to it. Yeah. Ask the machine, what does red feel like? Like this is important. Yeah, like that's the thing that drives humanity. That's what like causes wars. It's what's like what shapes politics. All of these things that are happening now, like with Palestine, with the UK, with immigration issues, with this and with that, whatever it is, yeah. Like it's driven by feelings. Like it's driven by people that are worried, that are greedy, that want, that desire, that like that's a big part of all of this. That's a big part of the human experience. It's a big part of what shapes us as communities. It's a big part of what it means to be alive and to be human. And robots are like an example of, if you're just seeing the world as only a collection of atoms, like how do you get from that to everything that we have?
Exactly. Yeah.
Sorry, so I went on a bit of a wild thing, but it was just I really wanted to.
No. Okay, it's fine. Yeah, but then it's massively reinforced the point that what we feel, and maybe people might have had their own experience when they saw that painting. For example, when I saw that painting, the one word came to my mind, nihilism. Because it felt like this person is feeling meaningless and purposeless, or this like that came to my mind. So not exactly what you were thinking, but somewhat similar. And there was one
because you're relating to it in like
in my own.
This is it, and it's like, but this collection of colors of lines, like because like objectively, that's all it is. It's not really a person, is it? It's not really a man. And like, if you just think about what it is, it's literally just it's paint smeared onto a canvas. And then he's smeared it this way, he's smeared it that way, and it's giving the illusion of a scene. It's not really a scene. It's not really a man. There's not really a pie happening on there. It's just paint mixed and mashed in a certain way, and yet it presents itself as this 3D scene that elicits in you certain emotions, certain words, certain feelings, certain like thoughts and questions and answers, and it links to life and existence, and like that's interesting. That's strange. That's weird. That's not just atoms bouncing off atoms. There is much more to this going on, and then so it touches on the hard problem of consciousness. That like, how do you get all of this? How do you go from there just being atoms bouncing off atoms to all of these like massively complex emotions and feelings and questions and thought processes and logic and reason, like Joshua Rasmussen sort of describes when he lists them out, like where this, how do you explain that now in a universe that is created by a conscious being By conscious, I mean by a being that is alive, that has life, yeah, that is wise and knowing, and that it has a will and is making choices and has wisdom, and is acting and is doing things with that wisdom. With it's not doing things like Allah said in the Quran. I do not do things arbitrarily. It's not without reason. Yeah, he does things with his wisdom, with his knowledge. Yeah. Now, with that, you can see how a world where these things play out, that does follow from that. Yeah.
Right.
There's like a clear flow from this independent, necessary being that's like existing in its own unique way with these attributes that it has. And then it's creating things, and it's creating things with function, with meaning, with purpose, with goals, with, you know, all of these things are playing out with beauty. Yeah, like the creation of the universe it is exponentially beautiful. Like it's there's all of these things are being expressed. Yeah, the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are manifesting through his creation of things. Like you can see the manifestation of Allah's wisdom when you're looking at the universe. Yeah, when you're looking up at the stars and you watch these videos where they zoom in and they show you the atom or the particles, and then they zoom out and it goes from the atom, the particle, out to molecules, to the human, to the city, to the country, to the world, to the solar system, to the universe. And it's like, and it just blows your mind, like all of the levels of complexity. And I think the biggest obstacle that people have is they have everything has become so normal to them. They don't
familiarized.
Yeah, that they don't see how impressive it is. They don't, like, they've become blind to the signs of Allah, despite the fact that they are completely surrounded by.
I wanted to get at, so alhamdulillah, you helped me, of course, like these things are useful. So when it comes to materialism, which we were talking about in terms of world just composed of atoms and molecules, we clearly see with so many examples that you provided and what we were talking about, that there are things that cannot just be reduced to material reality. This is where we spoke about, for example, consciousness, the hard problem of consciousness. So the materialists, people who believe in materialism, they adhere to materialism. They came up with 5 to 6 different strategies to explain these subjective aspects. One is known as the eliminative materialism. What they did is they tried to actually, because they could not make sense of it from a materialistic perspective, so they had 2 options: either to reject materialism altogether and embrace this kind of self that we have, the consciousness, or to actually reject the self. And they took the second option, ironically, which is that instead of eliminating materialism, they eliminated the self, which is where people like Daniel Dennett and many others, they started saying that, oh, no, it's an illusion. It's an illusion. But bro, illusion itself is a state of consciousness. You cannot explain away consciousness by calling it an illusion.
It's the thing itself. Like, they, in order to try throw this thing out of the window, they have to presuppose a bunch of stuff that depends upon the idea of a self in order to be able to do that at all. And it's the same with you mentioned Dennis. Was it Dennis? Sam Harris as well does the same thing. And he wrote a book about it.
Right.
And he does the same thing. Like, he gets rid of the self in order to remain able to be committed to materialism.
Materialists try to have like 5 or 6 approaches to explain the subjective aspect of consciousness. One was eliminative materialism, which does not work at all. We saw. Second, I think you touched briefly, which was reductive materialism, which you cannot reduce consciousness to just a mere atoms, molecules, or genes or something along those lines. You cannot do that. And in fact, there are some arguments that actually show that those things change, those things get replaced, but the identity remains constant. So you cannot just reduce it down to molecules or cells. And then there is behaviorism that does not work. Functionalism does not work. And I don't want to go deep in this. Is not necessary. You can see it for yourself how it does not work out. In fact, Hamza Zorjis has a chapter in his book which kind of deals with all of these different types of materialism which fail. And then there is behaviorism, which does not work. Functionalism does not work. And I don't want to go deep in this. Is not necessary. You can see it for yourself how it does not work out. In fact, Hamza Zorjis has a chapter in his book which kind of deals with all of these different types of materialism which fail. One last one was like, emergence. Emergence itself is not an explanation. You just give a word to something you don't know how it functions. Like, for example, you just, if someone says that, I am rubbing a lamp and a genie comes out of it, someone can say, oh, there's just emergence. But you'd be like, a material is like, no, that's not an explanation. The same way they cannot just say that neural filings in the brain emerges consciousness. You still need the explanation. The explanation,
Yeah, which is really
this,
important.
yeah,
And
yeah,
the analogy they used there was great as well. Like, and I think people really, 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 really need to grasp that is not an explanation. That is not in any way, shape, or form a satisfactory explanation. And like,
exactly.
and when theists do something similar, they're very, very, very quick to jump onto that and go, hold on a second, that isn't an explanation
Hmm.
at all. And
Hmm.
they're fair to do so when they say that, especially if you present it as an explanation. And like pointing out that, and just to sort of repeat it, pointing out that consciousness is emergent isn't an explanation. It can't, it's not like you need to now explain to me how that process takes place in order for it to be a satisfactory explanation. And if you can't do that, that's fine. That's fine. But don't act like we've sussed it out, because that's what
Right.
they're doing. They're like, when you're talking to an atheist, they're like, oh
Hmm.
no, but it's just emergent. It's like, we've already figured it out. Like, it's obvious. This
Hmm.
problem has been solved. You're just like, no. By saying it's emergent, you haven't solved the problem. You've not
Yeah.
like gotten an answer to this that's satisfactory, so that we can now just leave this alone and pretend
Hmm.
it's not an issue. No, it's something that still very much needs to be addressed. And like, and that's the point. It's like materialism is, it's as far as I'm concerned at the moment, is completely incapable of dealing with this. And this huge
Exactly.
gap between it and this inability to explain it is because it cannot explain it. It doesn't even make sense trying to, in the same way, when we're talking to Christians sometimes, and we're talking about why the Trinitarian theology is problematic. Yeah. And like,
Hmm.
I'm pointing out like the LPT, the logical problem of the Trinity. And then they say, oh, no, but
It's a mystery.
yeah, it's a mystery, bro. It's a mystery. We don't, it's like, no, it's not a mystery. Like, it's got nothing to do with mystery. It's got to do with the fact that the sentences that you are uttering are completely meaningless. And they're like, oh, but you're putting
Hmm.
limits on God. No. I'm not. I'm putting limits on you. You, if you want
Hmm.
to communicate something to me, you have to say things that make sense. And if you are just like adding words together that cannot be added together, you haven't said anything meaningful to me. Yeah,
Hmm.
you've not done it properly. And so, like, that is not that's not dealing with the issue. There is still this
Hmm.
fundamental
Hmm.
problem,
Hmm.
and the problem is clearly a problem. Like, like
Right.
the LPT is a problem. Like, it is the is of an is of identity, or is it an is of predication? And like, if you pick either one of them, you're led to a contradiction, and so it can't be either of them, and so therefore this is a meaningless statement. Like, it doesn't, it's not communicating anything at all. You might as well
Right.
not have said anything. Like, if I tell
Hmm.
you my mate Dave is a married bachelor, I've not told you anything about Dave. Dave is what? Is he married or is he a bachelor? Because you
Exactly.
can't be both
Exactly.
of them. They negate each other.
I get it. Hmm.
And although they mean something independently, they do not mean something together. And I'm saying here that the idea of like trying to explain consciousness with materialism, like like it does not make sense. Go on.
So one thing about consciousness very interesting is when I had a conversation with Joshua Rasmussen, and he is kind of has many books, like it's more than one book on just the aspect of consciousness. He's been doing research for years, and he said something very shocking, and I wanted him to highlight that in the discussion. So he said, producing conscious beings out of mindless, non-conscious materials is worse than a contradiction. How can you say that it's a worse than a contradiction? I've never seen someone say something like that. I asked him. He said that I've said that because a contradiction in itself creates one very big problem, which is you cannot say A and not A at the same time. It's a violation of one law. But when you say that, okay, mindless, non-conscious materials create conscious or produce conscious beings, it's more than 5 problems which you cannot deal with. We don't have the time to actually deal with all of those 5 problems, but he says that because all of these problems are which materialists cannot actually explain, it is even worse than a contradiction. So one of the problem was the hard problem of consciousness which they cannot deal with. There was other one. I'll just deal with 2 of them. I think 2 of them would be fine. And inshallah, I can attach the video and people can have a look at it. The second he was talking about is the binding problem or the unification problem, which is again a very big problem. Like for example, there are 3 trillion or 3 billion trillion some neurons in our head, and all of neurons only function of doing an action. They initiate an action. That's it. They don't do like, or they continue a continuation of initiation of actions or something along the lines is the function of a neuron. But like for example, the whole unified self that you have, which for example, when we experience, we see with the same time having experience, visual experience with auditory experience. At the same time, if I'm tasting something, I have this unified self, even though there's no unification happening in on a materialistic sense. So from this perspective, the binding problem itself you cannot ground in a materialistic perspective, because how would you bind, like how would you bind and create one unified self? If I have a book and this book has like, let's say 1,000 or 10,000 words, 20,000 words, this book, the book itself would not have like a unified self of all of those words coming together and having a self of its own, like a conscious experience of its own. So within our body, we have these kind of different cells. We have neurons, but how is it the case that we have this one unified self experience? Again, that's a huge problem for materialism. There's also an identity problem through time. One more problem, which is when for example, we look at our body, within 1 or 2 years, 98% of the atoms get replaced. So if 98% of the atoms are getting replaced within my body, means cells take in chemicals, they give out chemicals, so the atoms are replacing. So what is left within me that I can call me? Identity cannot be grounded in materialistic sense. Like if I committed murder, for example, not me, let's say someone did committed murder, let's say 10 years ago. Now you're giving sentence to him. There is no single atom within him that actually was there when the murder was committed. So like there are some issues that come up.
Yeah, it's called the Ship of Theseus. So it's a story about the ship, and like it's said that the ship is made of certain planks of wood, and it's certain sails and certain sailors. And then someone's saying, "Oh, you know, this is the Ship of Theseus," and it's like a really, really old boat. And like over many years, like slowly, every plank has been completely replaced. Every nail has been replaced. Every sail has been replaced. The sailors themselves have died and been replaced. And so like after so many years, the Ship of Theseus has like nothing in common with the ship when it was first made, because like in the beginning, everything has been replaced over a very long period of time, to the point where nothing, like every single plank is completely different from the first time. Every single nail, every single sail, every single sailor, all of those things have been completely changed. And then it asks the question, is it still the Ship of Theseus? And the whole point is like, what's this question of identity? Like, what remains? What is identity? Is identity something that's grounded in the material, in the things itself? Or is there something sort of meta going on here? Is there something transcendental, something, you know, supernatural, I guess, or however you want to word it to it? Is it something more to that? And then we're asking that question now, because the Ship of Theseus is a unconscious object. It's just a thing. Yeah. Exactly, so that idea of identity, because and there's a simpler version of it. There's a program in England called Only Fools and Horses. Have you ever seen it?
No.
It's really funny. It's a proper like classic British comedy. And there's a man with a broom, and he's like, yes, I've had this broom for 75 years or whatever it is. Like it's like, and you know, he's like, oh really? That's a really old broom. And he goes, yeah, I've had to change the handle 20 times, and the broom I've had to change 17. And he's like, how is it? And so he's changed like everything of it. It's like, well, how is that's not the same? And it's the same question. Like, how is that the same broom then? Like, exactly. This guy's got an attachment to it. He thinks he's got the same room. And because for him, I guess the identity is more than just the physical aspect of it. And
Exactly.
so now the question
Right.
applies to conscious human beings. Like, if every single one of your atoms, because you're saying however long it takes, 98%. Now, the question is like, so in that 2%, is that where your identity lies? Where is that 2%?
Mhm.
What is it? And like, does that 2% in those however many years, does that get replaced later on? And then it's a
Mhm.
different 2% that remains? Like, and so like
Mhm.
from when you're a baby, how many of the atoms in your body are still there when you're an old man? And how
Mhm.
does this idea of identity sort of exist and continue to exist over that time? Um, and if
Exactly.
all of those things completely change, but you remain, is it
Mhm.
is it rooted in the atoms at all? Like how what's going on here? So yeah, it's interesting. Check it up there. The ship of Theseus. That whole problem is
Yeah.
a really fun one to think about.
Subhanallah. Yeah. So moving back to materialism, we clearly see that it has failed to account for this aspect of reality. Now, a few things that I want to touch on here is maybe go through a few quotes to establish the point. Since I didn't get the chance to share these earlier, so let me drop them here. These quotes are actually quite revealing, and I think you will find them really interesting. So, the first one is from a Nobel Prize winner. So, he's a neurophysiologist and a philosopher. He says, nowhere in the laws of physics or in the laws of the sciences, chemistry, and biology is there any reference to consciousness or mind. Then we have Thomas Nagel, who's a well known atheist philosopher. He says materialism is incomplete even as a theory of the physical world, since the physical world includes conscious organisms among its most striking occupants. Then we have Colin McGinn. He says the problem with materialism is that it tries to construct the mind out of properties that refuse to add up to mentality. The thing is that even atheist philosophers have recognized this. Joshua Rasmussen himself was saying that, many atheist philosophers themselves are moving away from materialism because they can clearly see that, materialism cannot ground this aspect of reality. Professor Stephen Law himself, who's an atheist, agnostic atheist, he himself says that, this problem, you cannot just rely on science to solve this problem. The mind body problem is not something that you can just rely on science. And if we actually ponder on it, is it something that science can solve in the future? Is it just the god of the gaps or something? No, because when we're talking about this first person subjective aspect, this first person, science in principle inherently is in the third person. So if science by default in its own nature fundamentally is within the third person, you can, even no matter how science grows, it can never touch this first person aspect, because in principle, science is not what we are talking about, or science cannot touch this first person subjective self. So we can also move that point aside where we think that, okay, someday you might be able to explain it. No, this itself is an ontological reality that cannot be grounded from a materialistic perspective. This is what we conclude. And the second thing is that if we look at our lives, in fact, the conscious experience that we have is more fundamental than the material reality. Now, let's go through some interesting quotes that allude to the point that I said earlier, which is that consciousness is more fundamental than material reality. So, we have a Nobel Prize winning physicist. He says, consciousness cannot be accounted for in physical terms, for consciousness is absolutely fundamental. It cannot be accounted for in terms of anything else. Another one which I find very interesting is from a Russian American physicist. He says, let us remember that our knowledge of the world begins not with matter but with perceptions. I know for sure that my pain exists, my green exists, and my sweet exists. Everything else is a theory. So here he is reminding us that our starting point is not the physical world but our conscious experience of it. He's saying that the only thing we directly know are our perceptions like pain or the color green, while matter itself is something we infer through those experiences. Consciousness is more fundamental in a sense than material reality. So you cannot say that someday material reality is going to explain it when it's a distinct ontological reality. Yeah, go ahead.
So Immanuel Kant touches on this. Like he's talking about the issue of like the idea of science as being completely like objective. He's not necessarily using these very words, but he's pointing out how, in a sense, maybe this is a way of simplifying it. When we look at, like, you've got these words, objective, subjective, yeah, and we say we've got subjective facts, like I like ice cream or I don't like whatever, yeah, Marmite, X, Y, and Z. If you've got things you like and you don't like, we're not talking about objective things. We're talking about personal preference, and they vary and they differ. Like, there's nothing objective about chocolate ice cream being the best ice cream flavor. Yeah, that's personal preference. It differs from me to you or whatever. If everyone agreed, then maybe there would be something we could say was objective about it. If you, no matter who you asked, you said, "What's your favorite flavored ice cream?" and they all said chocolate. Yeah, that might become something objective all of a sudden. And what we're noticing and what we call objective, it's not that we know that this is the case in an absolute sense. What we're saying is that it's objective in that out of everyone's subjective experiences, this is consistent across all of those experiences. So you have this first person perspective, you've got mine, you've got yours, and what we're saying is objective is essentially intersubjective. It's common across all subjective experiences, and the objective information that we have about the universe, it's abstracted from the first person subjective experiences of a collection of people. And we're saying it is the case across all of these. And so Kant, he talks about like this sort of issue of the reality in itself, like that it's impossible to get that. And Nietzsche sort of touches on it as well. And he's talking about like, so you've got this multiple levels of interference. Yeah, that you've got an object. Let's say we're trying to, we've got a little bottle of aftershave, yeah? And we're trying to study this for science and say objective things about it. Now, the problem is that like any information that we get about this object when we're observing it, it's already been filtered and messed around with by our brains, by our minds, by our consciousness. And that these are mechanisms that we play no role in. We're not in charge about how, for example, when the light hits this and then the light bounces off that and hits our eyes, there's one, Nietzsche calls it a metaphor. He says there's one transformation of information. You've got light, it hits the object interferes with that information and then releases it back out. Then the light hits your eyes, and when it does that, then there's a transferring of the information from light into electrons that run through the nerves in your head. Yeah. So the light hits your eyes, and then that light is transformed into a different kind of information. And then it runs through the nerves in your brain and goes to the different parts of your brain. And then it's transformed from electrons running through nerves into an idea, into an image, into information that you think about and deal with. And what he's pointing out is there's like multiple levels of the transformation of information from one state into another, and then from another state into another, and on lots of levels. And the point is that like, how can we be certain from like a completely atheistic perspective that the objects of our experience resemble the objects in themselves? Because there's this, it's like there's a curtain between us and reality. You've got all of these things happening out in the universe, and we're trying to engage with them, but they're constantly being filtered by our minds in order to be able to engage with them. And that information is being played with by these sort of like inbuilt systems that we've got here. And so there's no way, like objectively speaking, of being able to say how we describe things has anything to do with how things are in reality. Because all we have the ability to do is mess about and engage with information that's been pre-filtered. Yeah. and then presented to us after it's been filtered, after it's been messed about with. And then we're engaging with the products of that. We're engaging with the results of what our brains and our minds and our bodies present to us as experiences. When we're dealing with the messed about with information, we're not dealing with the actual object in and of itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
You're following?
I get it. So
but that's a problem. That's a problem. How
exactly.
how do you get from that to this, and then say that we've got access to absolutely objective information in that sense?
I get it. And you know, just to finish on, like, you know, just to end on consciousness, I think I had a few quotes to bring in. One is from David Chalmers himself, who has some extensive literature on the art problem of consciousness. He mentioned that the failure of materialism leads to a kind of dualism. There are both physical and non-physical features of the world. This is, I think, what we can conclude. Now, if we have concluded this, and we go back and see which worldview actually makes sense of this as non-physical features, or best explains or most adequately explains this aspect of reality. So one thing we need to note here, that there are non-theistic immaterial accounts that attempt to explain consciousness without appealing to a divine mind. These views also face serious difficulties. A purely immaterial but non-theistic foundation still struggles to account for the broader metaphysical picture that emerges when we consider reality holistically. By this stage of our cumulative case, we have already established the existence of a necessary foundation that is independent, eternal, and the source of all contingent existence. We have also shown those arguments that this foundation possesses will, knowledge, and intentional action, which we covered in our previous parts. Against this backdrop, non theistic immaterial models no longer match the explanatory requirements. As discussed in the divine reality, such models lack the depth, coherence, and the simplicity that a theistic account provides, and they fail to integrate consciousness with the full range of other phenomena our worldview must explain. For these reasons, we don't need to treat them as competing explanations here, because within a holistic framework, the theistic foundations remain the most comprehensive and powerful account of consciousness. I think I'm quoting from the divine reality, where Hamza mentions that where did the immaterial substance come from? How does it exist in the physical universe? A theistic explanation provides a more coherent account on how the physical brain and non-physical consciousness interact. This is why a theistic type of dualism is the most coherent approach on this. Now, if we go back to what we were building on on our this Obsidian app, we have clearly seen this aspect of reality, consciousness. So the main point that we want to highlight here is why the foundation of reality must be conscious/aware. So I'm going to give 5 reasons. The first one would be consciousness is best explained by a fundamental aware source. Among all available explanations, the emergence of consciousness fits most coherently if the foundation of reality already possesses awareness. The existence of subjective experience is far more naturally explained when rooted in an aware conscious ground of reality. Then the second one would be experience is irreducible, so the foundation must be mind-like. No physical description can capture the what it is like of experience, since consciousness cannot be reduced to matter. The underlying reality must contain a non-physical experiential qualities. Third one would be intentionality and meaning point to a mind-based ground of reality. Consciousness is inherently about things directed towards meaning, value, and ideas. Purely physical processes have no meaning. This suggests that the source of conscious beings must itself be capable of intentional, meaningful awareness. The fourth one is mental causation implies a mind compatible universe. Our thoughts and intentions produce real effects in the physical world. If mental states can cause physical changes, then the fundamental structure of reality must already be open to mind based causation, which implies a mind like foundation. And last one would be conscious beings require a conscious cause. Effects resemble their causes. Minds do not emerge from what has no trace of mentality. The existence of conscious beings points back to a source that possesses awareness in some form. So, these are some robust points that we need to look at. And I think this helps us to establish our point. this is what I wanted to highlight with this particular aspect of reality consciousness, which does help us to conclude some feature of aspect of fundamental reality, the necessary existence. You have anything to add to that?
No, it's I think we've sort of covered that as much as it needs to be covered.
Yeah.
So to sort of summarize and conclude, like if you have this necessary being, and it is distinct and independent from me, you, creation as a whole, you can run through certain implications of the fact that it exists the way that it does, and see how, for example, if you're looking at it has this relationship, it is independent, and everything is dependent upon it, and then you see in these things evidences to show that this thing must be this thing. Sorry, this being, the creator must have attributes of knowledge, of wisdom, of life, of will. It's making choices, and that it must itself be alive, of conscious. That it's and that there's this. That these attributes can be deduced from the fact that the necessary being does exist, and from the fact that, like, the creation, the world that we live in, is expressing certain things which make it clear that whatever gave rise to this must have these other attributes as well. And then I think there was one more. What was the next one that you wanted to cover?
Yeah, so I wanted to cover one more aspect of reality, just like how we saw this non-material aspect of reality, which was consciousness. There's another non-material aspect of reality, which we can call morality, which is another dimension of reality, one that is non-material. In some sense, you can say, if you find some universality to it, and impossible to reduce to physics, is morality, basically.
Yeah.
So when we look at, like, for example, like, we all intuitively have this aspect that some things are wrong. Torturing children for fun is wrong. Saving a drowning child is good. We don't learn these from society necessarily. We just see them. There's some insight related to it. Now there might be some issues with the particulars. We cannot actually come to, like, necessary knowledge about some particulars about of morality, but there is something about morality that is not just reducible to society or culture. There are some, for example, some psychologists and some cognitive scientists like Jonathan Haidt and Paul Bloom. They do some research on children, and they come to the conclusion that human beings, it's something fitri. It's like a natural disposition for human beings to see reality in this kind of good bad kind of aspect, where they feel that if there is something bad that needs that, like, when they play with toys also, and you give them a description of this toy is bad or this toy is good, children, they feel that, okay, if this is a good toy, then it needs to be rewarded in some sense, or if it's a bad toy, it needs to be punished in some sense. Then there are some ideas of justice they have. I forgot, there were many experiments that within one article that Dr. Nasir Khan was highlighting. But the point is that this intuitive aspect of morality that does exist, which is an aspect of reality, we can say, cannot just be reduced, like good and bad cannot just be reduced to material reality. Now, this might be based on some kind of values, some kind of value system that we see, some moral values that we come across. Like, for example, let's take the stone and child analogy. Take a stone and throw it off a cliff. Nothing morally wrong happened. Now take a child and throw them off the cliff. You have committed evil. However, same physics, same atoms, same motion, but one has moral worth and one doesn't, which shows morality is not in the atoms. From a materialistic perspective, both of them would be the same. They're just rearrangements of matter. You're rearranging matter in a different way. But this moral angle is something that materialism cannot account for. This is what I want to get at. So the stone and the child analogy shows something simple and undeniable. Physically, both scenarios are identical, yet morally they are worlds apart. This difference cannot be found in atoms, mass, or motion. It points to a deeper truth that there is a real moral distinction in the fabric of reality itself. In other words, some things are actually wrong and some things are actually right. This pushes us towards moral facts, not just mere opinions. As several philosophers themselves acknowledge this, let's take one example. Philosopher John Cottingham, he says that to everyone's surprise, the increasing consensus among philosophers today is that some kind of objectivism of truth and of value is correct. Consider another one by Michael Ruse, the man who says that it is morally acceptable to grape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 plus 2 is equal to 5. Even Ruse, a well known ethical skeptic and atheist agnostic, admits that denying certain moral truths is as absurd as denying basic arithmetic. Now let's take another atheist philosopher to drive the point home, who's Peter Cave. He makes even a sharper point. He says, whatever skeptical arguments may be brought against our belief that killing the innocent is morally wrong, we are more certain that the killing is morally wrong than the argument is sound. Torturing an innocent child for the sheer fun of it is morally wrong. Full stop. What Cave is hinting at here is that we are rationally entitled to trust our deepest moral perceptions unless we have overwhelming reasons not to. And no such reason exists. These examples build a simple point that our strongest moral intuitions are not illusions, they are perceptions of something real. Now, let me give you a very modest argument formulated by Jamie Turner to make a case for moral facts here. This is a Morean argument. Morean meaning the style of this argument comes from the philosopher George Edward Moore. So Jamie argues that if there are no moral facts, then our ordinary moral beliefs are false. He means to say if morality is an illusion, then all our judgments about kindness, cruelty, justice or injustice collapse into error. But it is more plausible that our ordinary moral beliefs are true than the argument against moral facts are sound. And the explanation is that our certainty about basic moral truths is stronger than any skeptical philosophical reasoning. It is a basic principle of our rationality that we should affirm what is more plausible than what is less plausible. And what he means here is reason demands that we trust the more obvious and fundamental belief when forced to choose. Therefore, we should affirm moral facts, which implies that the rational position is that moral facts really exist. So, when we combine the intuitive force of the child stone analogy and the admissions of leading philosophers on a basic principle of rational reasoning, the conclusion becomes almost unavoidable. Our moral judgments are not hallucinations, cultural habits, or evolutionary glitches. They track something real. There are moral facts, objective and binding, woven into the very structure of reality. Let me give you one simple example to drive the point home. So you see on the screen something that is subjective, that is taste. People have different preferences when it comes to taste. Some people, let's say, like vanilla ice cream, some might prefer chocolate ice cream. But there is also an aspect of reality like temperature, which has to be objective. This is what is beyond the human mind. It's not dependent on someone's taste. It has some kind of objectivity. Now, morality or some aspect of morality does fit within this category rather than the taste category. So, going back to our previous argument, we were talking about consciousness. And if consciousness tells us that there is a subjective dimension to reality, morality tells us something different. Morality tells us that there is some objective dimension to value built into reality. Moral realities might have influence from society, from culture, from our own personal experiences, but we are just trying to touch on this aspect which is beyond all of that, because we cannot just entirely entirely morality or moral values cannot just be reduced down to just aspects of society, culture or personal experiences. There's something beyond that.
Yeah. So you can sort of extrapolate to this, like the meta. Okay, so there may be like slight differences here and there about what they think good is or bad is. For example, polygyny versus monogamy, or whatever it is. Yeah. But the point is that like there is something that is overlapping all of these, and that is there is good. Yeah, there is right and wrong answers to these questions. That there is something bad, there is evil, and that good should be rewarded, and that bad should be punished. That is universal across all of these different conceptions of what good and bad is. And the fact that there are differences isn't necessarily problematic, because from the sense that like morality is a real thing, yeah, there isn't something to be rooted in the material, yeah. So the morality, that there is things you ought to do, yeah, that there are things you ought not to do, and that's not up for debate. If that is the case, yeah, that there are things you ought to do and you ought not to do, then we can say that there is good and that there is bad, and that like when we're talking about this, these things are meaningful, regardless of what society, what time, what place you're talking to. If you're talking to them about good things and bad things, abstractly speaking, not about the specifics, but about the idea of good, that are there things you ought to do? Are there things you ought not to do? All societies are all going to agree there are things you ought to do and there are things you ought not to do. And they're going to talk about it in a sense that is, quote unquote, we'll use the word objective for the sake of, they're not going to disagree that there are things you ought to do and there are things you ought not to do. There's going to be no debate about that, like across all societies. You may have individuals, it's like, because you've got this phenomena of like nihilism or moral nihilism cropping up now, where you have certain individuals that might say, "Oh no, but morality is a meaningless subject." And I think this is a consequence of other things, but that's not something we've never seen a morally nihilistic society, yeah, as a whole. You get these little expressions of it, like in these rebels, we'll call them, that try to sort of stem away from that. But as societies, there's not been a society with it at its foundation moral nihilism. What you've had is societies that have a sense of right and wrong, have a sense of things that are good and things that are bad, and that they agree that these things should be done or should not be done. And that's universal. Yeah, it goes across all of them. And so that's important to take into consideration.
Yeah. So when we so one thing we want to highlight is that there is this ontological aspect of morality and epistemological aspect of morality. So within epistemological aspect of morality, there are so many debates. Okay, is this moral? Is this not moral? This is based on our own knowledge. Like, how do we know what is moral, what is not moral? We keep that debate aside for at least this discussion. And this discussion is more about the ontological aspect of morality. And within this ontological aspect of morality, as you mentioned, you gave a very brilliant point, which was that we haven't seen a so completely amoral society in that sense. I mean, some philosophers even highlight that those who say that those who say that there are amoral, or they don't believe in morality, or they just believe in this very reduced subjective aspect of morality, still when they behave in the behavior, you find some contradiction or some inconsistencies where their human behavior itself at times dictates that they adhere even implicitly or explicitly, sometimes unknowingly, they adhere to some idea of morality which is beyond just the subjective. There are some various like some examples highlighted by philosophers, but I won't go there for now. We'll come back to where we were. There was one argument formulated by Jimmy Turner where he says that there are some moral truths. He actually gives them 4 aspects which you can see. One is that you grasp them immediately. They are intuitive in some sense. They have some necessary nature to it. That is what he says. Not social inventions, but something beyond the social. Then they are normative. They tell us what we ought to do. This ought aspect comes to it. And they are non-natural. You cannot touch, weight, or measure wrongness in a lab. Now, if these moral truths exist, what explains them? Like, why do they have authority over us? Why do they bind us? Why do they feel necessary and universal rather than human invention? Which worldview can actually adequately ground, just like we saw how consciousness can be grounded in theism. Now we again see that which worldview can adequately ground this aspect of reality. And we take our first candidate, which is naturalism. And under naturalism, like, where do non-physical moral truths come from? There's a question. Why should they have authority over us? Like, if there is some ought, why should they have authority over us? Why do they feel necessary rather than evolved preferences? And this is where naturalism finds it really hard to make sense of these odds, or this kind of feeling of something being necessary for us. And evolution can explain why we feel hunger, for instance, within their worldview. What it cannot explain, why cruelty is genuinely wrong in a fabric of reality. So there are various aspects when it comes to evolution which cannot in any sense explain this ontological aspect of morality. There are some issues with epistemological aspects as well, which are known as evolutionary debunking arguments for morality, but that's a different subject. I won't touch it on it in this debate. In this discussion. So if naturalism has to account for this, naturalism reduces morality to at times feelings, preferences, social conditioning, evolutionary insights. All of them fail to actually adequately account for it. Sometimes naturalists can take other routes as well. Although there are several non-theistic strategies to ground objective morality, such as naturalistic reductions, non-theistic Platonic moral realism, axiarchism, various constructivist models, each of these accounts captures only fragments of what morality actually is. Theism, by contrast, offers a far more comprehensive explanation because it provides a single, unified source for features that secular theories either have unexplained or reduced to impersonal facts. It is also important to step back and remember what has already been established in this series. We have argued that reality cannot be ultimately grounded in contingent things, so there must exist a necessary and independent foundation of reality. We have also seen through arguments from design, causation, consciousness, etc., that this foundation must be mind-like, conscious, knowledgeable, and capable of will and choice. You can see that we have provided a model that gives a comprehensive account of order and harmony in the universe, design, meaning and purpose, beauty, and even consciousness. This matters because once a fundamental personal reality is already in the picture, moral facts cannot simply free float or terminate in impersonal abstractions. Whatever grounds morality will ultimately have to fit within this deeper metaphysical framework. Within a theistic framework, moral obligations have genuine authority because they stem from a personal, perfect legislator. Moral normativity is grounded in the will and nature of a morally perfect being. Human dignity is secured through our creation with purpose, agency, and worth. Moral responsibility is coherent through free will and ultimate accountability. Theism integrates all of these dimensions into one coherent moral ontology, whereas non-theistic accounts inevitably fragment the moral realm, explaining some features while failing to justify others. We have to examine which view accounts for morality in the fullest sense. The idea that moral obligations as experienced have a unique character and that attempts to explain moral obligations must illustrate that special character. Even granting the strongest secular attempts to ground objective morality, important explanatory gaps remain. Some views treat moral facts as brute, others appeal to abstract principles or fundamental values, but these strategies often leave morality unexplained at precisely the point where it matters the most, namely its authority, its binding force, and its personal significance. Moral truths begin to look either ontologically mysterious or normatively disconnected from why they should command us. By contrast, theism does not add a new layer of explanation but situates morality within an already established metaphysical framework where moral norms have authority because they arise from a necessary personal source, where moral responsibility and moral hope make sense within ultimate accountability. Even where secular theories succeed in enumerating particular aspects of morality, theism offers a simpler and more comprehensive explanation of the whole. As Adam Johnson says, God seems to fit the bill better as the ultimate ontological stopping point that needs no explanation because he, as commonly understood by theists, is an infinite, necessary, concrete, and most importantly, causal being. Now let us move from theory to lived experience. Imagine a man completely alone, no society, no observer, no future consequences, no reputational loss, no legal system, and no possibility of being discovered. He commits a serial moral wrong deliberately. Not by accident, not under compulsion. This act is over, the victim is gone, nothing remains in the human world that can be affected by what he did. Yet, long afterward, what remains is not mere memory, regret, or psychological discomfort, but guilt. The sense that the wrong still stands, that it's still answerable even though there is no one left to answer. Impersonal moral facts can describe the wrongness of the act, but they struggle to explain why wrongdoing leaves behind this residual of answerability rather than merely a recollection of past events. Theism explains this naturally because moral failure is not just a bad state of affairs but a failure before a personal moral reality. A quote from Peter Williams where he says that since it would be inappropriate to feel guilt or shame before an abstract impersonal moral principle. So like when we do something wrong, like we actually feel this idea of feeling shame or guilt. But if morality, like morality in an ontological sense was grounded in an impersonal entity, you like this kind of impersonality would not actually make sense. So he says that since it's appropriate to feel guilt and shame before the objective moral law, the moral law cannot be abstract moral principle. In other words, objective moral values must be ontologically grounded in a transcendent personality before whom it is appropriate to feel moral guilt. Feeling guilt before an abstract principle makes less sense. You don't feel shame before mathematics, you don't apologize to gravity, you do not feel remorse towards evolutionary history. Guilt is more fitting when directed towards a person. This is exactly the point Peter Williams highlights. If it is appropriate to feel guilt before the objective moral law, then that law cannot be merely impersonal. The experience itself points beyond abstraction to personality. Secular morality can describe guilt, but it cannot fully justify its appropriateness. Theism can. Guilt makes more sense if morality is grounded in a transcendent personal reality before whom our actions genuinely matter. Other examples point in the same direction. Let me give you another example to drive the point home. Gratitude makes more sense towards the giver, not towards blind processes. Notice how strange it would be to say, I am deeply grateful to the law of chemistry, or I feel thankful towards natural selection. Gratitude is less fitting towards impersonal processes. It is better fitting towards the giver. When people cultivate gratitude, it is almost always gratitude towards someone, not towards blind mechanisms. That very structure of gratitude points beyond impersonal reality to a personal source from whom life, goodness, and care are ultimately received. Take another example, moral accountability. Moral accountability itself makes more sense before a judge than before a personal system. You can take moral hope as well. Moral hope is the expectation that justice ought to be answered even when it is denied in this life. This sits uneasily within secular frameworks, but finds a more complete explanation within theism. These experiences are not psychological tricks, they are part of the data, and theism explains them far better than secular accounts. So, there is more to reality than simply being objective. The objectivity of morality is like the skeleton, and then the full ontological quality is like the organ and tissue. So, we want to consider the full range of what makes morality significant. At this point, the cumulative picture allows us to move to a formal argument. The question is not whether moral facts exist, but what kind of reality is required to ground their authority, normativity, and personal character. The moral argument. Objective moral values and duties exist. Objective moral values and duties require an explanation of their authority, normativity, and binding force. A personal moral source best explains the authority, normativity, and binding force of objective morality and duties. God is understood as a necessary, transcendent, personal moral source. Therefore, God is the best explanation of objective moral values and duties. This makes more sense than any other view where you don't have a person, like when you are not grounding morality in personhood. And that's where I rest my case. I believe that this actually can help us actually to come at one more attribute of God, which is goodness itself. And if we see that if goodness is another attribute which the most plausible case hints on has to be grounded in this necessary reality, this fundamental reality, we cannot say that that would be limited. So that attribute itself we have to take in a maximal sense. So therefore this can help us to say that God is all good, and that would be the most plausible explanation of these things that we have seen so far. So yeah, that's all I have to say. If there is anything that you differ on, let me know.
Of what I would add to that, so for me,
Yeah.
fundamental to a discussion about ethics and morality and things like that is an inescapable idea, and it's related to goals. Yeah, when you say you ought to do something, it's usually you ought to do something with a particular goal in mind. Like you ought not do this because we don't want, or we don't need this sort of outcome. And like, you can't separate moral discussions from discussions about desires and about goals and about aims and purpose and function of how societies operate together for a greater end. Like, they're thinking, again, it's like a part of morality is this idea of intentionality. Now, if you were talking about sort of the word objective here is being used, yeah, with this idea of like an objective morality, or like the morality is real. You can't make sense of that from like a completely materialist perspective, because we already said as well that like an absolute materialist perspective as being the foundation of the universe, one of the consequences of that is it even negates the self. And if it negates the self, it therefore negates a community. And it therefore negates this idea of like an obligation or a contract between peoples. And so like, if you're going for this materialist perspective, what ends up happening is you sort of like make the whole conversation about morality meaningless. Like, if there is no self, if the self is an illusion, then how can you have contracts between different selves, between different individuals that see themselves as selves? How can you see their being as like absolute obligations between these people? And like that kind of thing, this sort of idea of a transcendent justice is like, this is something we are all held to equally, yeah, that each of us are bound to this concept. That does not make sense in like even the idea of justice. What does that even mean from a materialist perspective? Yeah, like this concept that is above and beyond humanity, whether or not humans were here, is this idea of justice. Does it outlive that? Does it predate humans? Is it an eternal thing? Like logic, for example, like, you know, is logic dependent upon humans? It doesn't make sense to talk about it like that. And if you're talking about justice, if it's a real thing, essentially it should as well be something irrelevant of whether or not humans exist. Yeah, like can there be discussion about justice between animals as well? Is there, like, from a materialist perspective, does it make sense to talk about justice among the dinosaurs, justice among bacteria, justice among other things? Like, what does this even mean? And the whole point is if it is fundamentally connected to this idea of consciousness, of intentionality, of goals, of purpose, of agreements between parties, an obligation to fulfill and uphold those agreements, like you cannot escape the connection between morality, between justice and the relationship to consciousness. Now, what that means is, if at the base, fundamentally, if God doesn't exist, where certain people are concerned, you can't have an idea of this absolute morality. Like, if you say you should not behave like this, if I don't share the same levels of empathy that you do, if I don't share the same goals as you or the same anything, like, why should I do what you want me to do? And like, you sort of see this being expressed in prevalent corruption across the planet. Like, you know, okay, the people say that our leaders shouldn't do this and shouldn't do that, but as far as they're concerned, why not? Like, if God doesn't exist, if they're not like bound by this sort of grand idea of justice, if the universe is just atoms hitting atoms, why should they not just do whatever they want? Oh, because so what? So what? Why should they care? They might never meet you. You're not like a part of their life in any way, shape, or form. Whether you exist or don't exist, these politicians in parliament, the presidents in government around the world, like whether if you were to die today, they wouldn't notice. They wouldn't notice. So the question is why should they care? And there's no like, there's things you can say, oh, but but it always ends up appealing to like empathy and these feelings. But what if they don't have that? It's like, oh, but you should have empathy. Like they could just ask the same question: why should I have empathy? Why should I care? And like, if you keep saying, and then you got to sort of appeal to this good again. It's like, oh, well, if you don't, then you're a bad person. But it's like, well, hold on a second. Like, why should I play this game of like good and bad as you say it? What power do you have? What obligation are you appealing to? Especially if like the person appealing to it is also like a heavy materialist, and they're like, where are you getting this from? Why ought I behave the way you're expecting me to behave? Why should I not be this, that, and the other? And now I'm saying that as someone who does express or feel empathy for things. Like if I see someone bullying someone in a public sphere, I don't like that. I would like to stop that from happening. Yeah. There's all sorts of weird videos that float around on Twitter, and they break my heart when I see them. And I wish I could have been there to intervene and, or to do something, because I don't think that ought to happen. Like there was one video of a man, and like I don't get how, like, even his reactions were very strange, where like he essentially he set a cat on fire, and then he laughed and watched it running around while it burnt to death. And like that whole thing, because Twitter's random, like the weirdest things end up on your feed, and people are quoting them like, this is horrible, this man should be in prison, and like you don't necessarily
what did he set on fire?
He set a kitten on fire, a baby cat.
Oh
and then he's recording it, and you can see the cat running around, and it's visibly in pain. And what's really weird is the way the man is reacting to it is so bizarre. Like you can tell from the video he's getting joy from it, and it's like, how is that not, like, I was hurting from watching it. Like I wasn't even there, and it's gone and happened. It's like the cat's dead. It's done. Like that. I don't even know how long ago that was, but when I was watching it, it was hurting. Yeah, and it's like, that ought not happen. Like, so I get it. I have these feelings of empathy for things, and I understand there's things that shouldn't be done and should be done. Like, for example, that man should be beat up. Yeah, he should be physically hurt for what he did. Yeah, and that, like, I'm not going to debate with anyone about that. That is irrelevant, though, to the discussion about if the world is fully materialist, yeah, and at base there is no God and there is no consciousness there that's giving rise to all of this. Okay, why should I care? Why should he care what I think? Yeah, why should the man that set fire to that cat give a crap that Yusuf over there watched this on a video and disliked it? Okay, we need to explain why this man should take that into consideration. And it's all like, it all ends up relying on other shoulds. Like, oh, well, you should have empathy. Like any decent human being should this and that and the other. It's like, well, hold on a second. What do you mean any decent human being? Like, where is this idea of a decent human being coming from? Again, it's all tied to your ideas of like sort of objectively necessary levels of empathy, but these things aren't necessarily in the control of the people. Like, you've got characters like David Wood, for example. He does not experience feelings the same way that we do. He's a clinical psychopath. Yeah, so like he doesn't care. He doesn't necessarily feel shame in the same way that we do, which has become very apparent from, like, for example, recent developments where like he's making open testimonies in a public sphere, and like you can see he does not care. Like he's not bothered what you think of what he's saying. He does not care. Like, he does not experience shame or guilt or embarrassment in the same way that me and you would do. Yeah. So like, and this is the thing, it's like human beings vary in their ability to express or feel these type of emotions. And the problem is if you're in a materialistic world, and you're talking to someone who does not have the experience of empathy in the same way that you do, you can't appeal to empathy to tell him the way he ought to behave. Because if empathy is the thing that should guide his actions and he doesn't have it, then he has no reason to do what you're telling him to do.
Exactly.
He has no reason to. Like, if the only motivating factor is that you should, quote unquote, feel bad. And it's like, what do you mean I should? I don't have control over my ability to feel shame about this thing or not. Yeah. Like, if, like that man, he did not have empathy for that cat. Now, to what degree is he in control of that, the level of empathy? Yeah. Now, if he's like, and you can't say that man was a man of God. Yeah. Because even if he lacks those, okay, he might not feel bad for the cat, but he should, to some degree, if he believes in God and he believes in God's justice and he believes in the day of judgment, he should desire not to be thrown in the hellfire, especially the way it's described. Yeah. Like, as much as a psychopath might be a psychopath, he's not necessarily going to want to experience the pain of burning eternally. Yeah. No one willingly wants to experience what hellfire is described as. And if someone is a believer, even if they're a psychopath, they're going to want to avoid putting themselves in a position where they have to experience the hellfire, whether they feel sorry for the cat or not. Yeah. And so here, this contractual agreement, if God exists and you're bound by it, you've got good reason to behave the way people with empathy would behave, because of the eternal consequences of it. And so it doesn't matter. You don't need to appeal to this idea of empathy for the thing that you're hurting. You don't need to appeal to this sense of decency that you should have, quote unquote, like, because you're looking at something grander than that. Now, not everyone needs to respond to it in the same way. Like, some people, whether they have religion or not, won't set a cat on fire. Yeah. Because they have certain levels of empathy, which won't allow them to enact such horror upon another living thing. Yeah. The problem is not everyone is like identical to everyone else. We've got some people have too much empathy, where like for example, there's
and that's problematic.
Yeah, like it can go to an extreme where like you have so much empathy that you can smother a thing and kill it with kindness. Like the mother, that's the overbearing mother that protects her son, like, too much, to the point where like she babies him when he's a 30-year-old man, and like he doesn't, like, he's never lived on his own. He's lived with his mum from being a baby, and he's a 30-year-old man. He's still living with his mum. He's never lived on his own. He's never done anything for himself. Like, he's never had to make a meal. He's never had to wash his own clothes. His mum has always put food on the table for him. He's never had to pay rent. She's constantly just giving him, and like, now the thing is when she dies, and that might be when he's 30, 40, 50, he's not been prepared to be a man. Yeah, he is not like a proper man should be able to go out into the world, and say, God forbid, something terrible was to happen and he was to be left alone with no family, with no one else there in the world. He should still be able to operate in society. Yeah, he should still be able to like eat and have a roof over his head and be able to like, you know, like look after himself. Whether or not he has a mum or a dad or a brother or a sister or a friend, like if like I feel confident that, God forbid, if all my family were to be taken away, I could still look after myself. Yeah, I could still make sure that I've got food. Like, if I need to make sure, like, for example, if I don't have a washing machine, I know where a laundromat is, and I should be able to go to the laundromat and pay whatever I need to pay, and so on and so forth. If I lose my job, I'll look for another one. Yeah, like no matter what's going on, to a certain degree, I should be able to sustain my own life and live comfortably, regardless of what's happening. But with this sort of overburdening mother that just sort of mollycoddles, she's experiencing too much empathy for her son, where she doesn't want him to experience any difficulty whatsoever. And there's an expression of that in a bad way, because there's too much of it going on. And is that, like, is empathy, like, having empathy, it seems to be a scale. Like, you can have not enough, where you're a clinical psychopath, too much, where maybe you're a different kind of psychopath. Like, and then there's somewhere in the middle is this sort of Goldilocks zone, yeah, where you've got just the right amount of empathy, where you're like, you still care about human beings. Now, the problem is like, that's not a switch. Like, I can't go up to someone that has too much empathy and go, oh, there's too much, I just need to turn that down a little bit. Or to someone that's like that doesn't have any, and go, oh, you need more. Like, oh, here's a pill. Here's the empathy pill. Take that and you'll maybe feel the proper feelings. So, like, and so there's the thing. So from a materialistic perspective, appealing to these oughts, rooting them in empathy, rooting them in these weird concepts that, like, it, when you really scratch past the surface, it does not make sense. And you're not giving like very large portions of society, significant portions, like, because people like there's, if it's, say, let's say it's a bell curve, yeah, even if they are a minority, like, there's 8 billion people on the planet, and even if 80% of them smack down in the middle, yeah, you've still got like 20% of 8 billion. That's millions of people that are not experiencing empathy in the same ways that you are. And not just that, like, even different goals can express different outcomes. Like, people might feel like certain things are more okay under certain circumstances than others, even if they feel empathy. Like the immigration problem in the UK, for example, people that are the same color, they'll feel empathy about that. Like, the things going on in Ukraine, like the white British nationalist can maybe feel more empathy for a Ukrainian that's going through suffering at the hands of whoever, because they can relate. Yeah, when they see these little children, because they're white with blonde hair, blue eyes, and they're coming across the border and they've come out of a war zone, it's like, oh, I need to help them. And they can feel empathy in this case because there's something that they can relate to. But then for some reason, they see the exact same thing happening to Palestinian children, and they don't feel empathy for, like, so empathy can even be contextual here. And so then, like, if you're just appealing to empathy, again, people can feel empathy depending on, differently depending on who they're dealing with, for seemingly arbitrary reasons. So, and I've had conversations with people that have very strong opinions about, for example, what's going on in Ukraine. And then, like, all of that goes out of the window, and they're like, oh, but that's just the way it is, isn't it? And then, like, they don't seem to care at all about what's going on to the kids in Palestine. Like, they don't feel any sadness whatsoever, and they can even laugh and joke about it. And it's like, what? I don't get how that works. So empathy seems to be conditional as well. And, like, if that's all you're appealing to, then we're going to have problems here where, like, I don't think the Palestinian children should be experiencing what they're experiencing at all. I don't think any of the Palestinians should. Yeah. And we're not just talking about the Muslims that are there, because it's not just Muslims, it's also Christians. Yeah, there are Christian churches that are thousands of years old that have been destroyed. And, like, should that be happening? No, like, that should not be happening. And it's obviously not happened while it was under Muslim rule, because if it was, they wouldn't have been there for the Israelis to be able to destroy it, because it was under Muslim rule for hundreds of years. So, like, how is this happening to a Christian population and Christian churches? If their argument is, oh, the Muslims would have done this, if they had control, it'd been even worse. No, they did have control, and it wasn't even worse, because those people were able to live there up until today, where it is now happening to them at the hands of the IDF. And so, like again, sort of linking this now back to morality, like, from a materialist perspective, they always end up having to appeal to empathy, to summarize, or to
Hmm.
these feelings they think you should have. Now the problem is that like you can't necessarily control whether or not you have those feelings. Yeah, and what a weird thing to root it in anyway. Feelings. Yeah, and like it sort of does it. It removes the obligation for the people that do not have them. Yeah, and like, and I could role play as a psychopath for someone, and they're like, "Oh, you should do this. You shouldn't." Like, if I'm saying, "Why should I not just do whatever I want? Why should I not like become a corrupt politician and just rob the people blind and take everything that I could? Why should I not just go rob banks? Why should I not just, like these little roadmen now, get an electric scooter, put a bally on, and just go and take everyone's phones off them that I can see? Like, if I'm able to ride past you and steal your phone, I'm going to do it. Why should I not do that? Tell me why. Oh, because you should have empathy for the people. You should care. You shouldn't want to make them feel. Do to others as you would do to yourself. It's like, I don't give a crap. It's not about whether, like, I don't want it to happen to me, but it doesn't mean I don't want to do it to others. Like, in the same way, for example, you could have someone that's like, he loves battle. And you get these types, like, the Viking warrior. I want to fight and die in battle. I want to go and now, if you've got that, and someone says, do to others as you want to yourself. Let's say, so I would like to die in battle. So therefore, I should help you die in battle. Let's fight each other. Let's have a battle then. That kind of principle doesn't work, because it's like, again, if I'm a psychopath, or if I've got these other desires that the average person doesn't have, then that could lead me to wanting to do things to others that they don't necessarily want. Like some people love fighting, bro. And some people go out specifically to look for fights. It happens here. There's all sorts of YouTube videos now where people will go and audit towns, and there's people that audit Bolton, and like there's some guys that go out and it's like you can see they want a fight. They want a fight.
Wow.
So they're trying to like egg it on, and they'll go up to people and they'll say certain things because they want to kick off. Yeah, and it's like, if they're following your principle of do unto others as you would have done to yourself, it's like, yeah, I would like someone to come and hit me so I can fight them and beat them up. So therefore, should I now go out and hit someone else so they have an excuse to fight me? Like, it sounds nice. It's like those sayings that people have on the walls. They oh crap, I've got to go. I have to pick up my daughter.
Yeah.
Didn't realize the time I went.
Yeah.
But to summarize, you get the point. Yeah, is that like there are things that sound nice, but when you scratch past the surface, they don't really help. Or they don't give you good reason to act in certain ways. Whereas theism does that, and it does it great. Like, you've got a conscious thing, you've got a contract to it. There's massive consequences for not following that contract. And that all makes sense. There's a nice flow from the fact that you've got this creator and he's making these contracts, he's creating things with reason and purpose. And like, you've now got obligations. Yet there's a flow from the beginning to end of that. And there's no issues there. Whereas from materialism, you've got like the universe is just dead matter. And then you have these things that feel empathy, and they're like, oh, well, you should have X amount. And it's like, well, no, because people don't have the same levels of empathy. And then it's like, why should anyone do what you think they should do? Or why does it even matter if the majority of people say that you should behave a certain way? If this individual doesn't want, why should you be able to dictate against him? Like, there's all these other problems, but I'll have to leave it there. And I really need to run because I'm supposed to be there now.
Sure. So I'll continue from there, inshallah. I just speak about what we could have covered. I'm not going to cover, and just link to what I had to link, inshallah. And then we'll see you again on God's oneness. Anyways, we have to complete this episode, inshallah. So there are some things that I will cover, inshallah. And then we can jump. We'll see you again, inshallah, on God's oneness.
No problem. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So we have a few things to cover. If we go back and see what we have covered so far, we have actually spoke about two particular arguments. These two particular arguments were looking at two different aspects of reality which materialism cannot ground. Okay, now we are not actually implying that, okay, all atheists necessarily have to be materialist. Okay, there are some versions of atheism that don't believe in a god but still believe in some immaterial realities. But if you look at it from a holistic perspective, still that becomes inadequate. And what we were trying to bring in this discussion was, if there are immaterial aspects of reality like morality and consciousness, so we have to, there are many others we could bring in, but for short, because we don't want this whole this series to be just on God's existence, we'll keep it short and we'll just cover these two aspects. Now within these two aspects, if these are two immaterial aspects of reality, which view grounds it in the most adequate sense, in the most plausible, which worldview provides the most explanatory scope? And you find that theism provides the most explanatory scope to these two aspects of reality, consciousness and morality, which you can ground within that being. If you're still not convinced by what we have built so far, that's fine. Let me offer something worth reflecting on from two contemporary heavyweights in philosophy and theology. First, consider Dr. Ryan Mullins. I asked him a simple but important question. If we already have reasons to believe in a necessary, omniscient, and omnipotent being, does goodness follow from that in any meaningful way? If you have omniscience and omnipotence, then you can directly derive omnibenevolent also, like God being all good. Because if God is omniscient, then he knows all moral facts as well. And if he's omnipotent, then he can bring out those states in some sense. So if you believe in both of them, then it does entail this as well. Is that correct?
I think so. And so if anybody reads my little book about a big God, in my chapter where I lay out the essential attributes of God, I start with God having the most power-granting set of abilities. And what I derive from God's omnipotence is this maximal cognitive excellence, which covers God's beliefs, it covers his rationality, and then from there you can logically derive perfect goodness, perfect free will, all this kind of stuff. So yeah, so I think these kind of arguments, I think they're very strong.
Next, suppose you remain unconvinced by objective moral realism and you're unsure whether moral facts exist in the strong sense I have been defending. Dr. Joshua Rasmussen takes a very modest route. His point is not that you must first accept objective moral truths in order to reach a theistic conclusion. Instead, he argues that certain moral features of reality call for explanation regardless of where you land in metaethics. When it comes to that foundation being supreme, that also implies that axiologically also that has to be supreme in one way, like in terms of
The
morals.
value. Yes.
In terms of value, it has to be supreme. So can you give me very briefly, some arguments that, if you have to convince someone that this foundation is axiologically supreme, or for example, this foundation is the whole, or it constitutes the foundation for morality, what kind of arguments can we use here?
So again, I'm kind of thinking of this part of the argument is more probabilistic. I know there are people who make arguments that are not probabilistic, that are kind of deductive, that if there are kind of moral standards, there's got to be some kind of ultimate anchor of those moral standards, and you can deduce a kind of foundational morality. But it's not that I'm against those arguments in principle. It's just that I find that you can make an argument just from probability, and I think that there's a certain kind of advantage. You can maybe appeal to more people that way, because you don't have to say.
I know. I just wanted to say you always take a very modest approach, and
modesty.
And I like that.
Yeah, because then you give people sort of the freedom to think about this, to kind of turn it over in their own minds, and you're saying, hey, here's some data. What's the best explanation of this data? Or even more modest than that, like, what's an explanation of this data? And then you can look at what's the simplest of the competing explanations. And so what I point out in the book there is that it looks like we have some kind of moral experience, a sense that some things are good or that some things are less good. And I even want to leave open whether that sense is tracking a kind of objective moral reality or a kind of subjective moral reality. There are different analyses of the moral reality. And again, for the sake of modesty and inclusivity, let me just say at least there's some kind of sense of good and bad, some kind of impression that things are good or things are not so good. Now I can ask myself, well, would a theory of fundamental reality as a kind of mindless reality, just particles, predict that there would emerge complex creatures that can actually have a not just consciousness, but a specific kind of consciousness, the kind of consciousness that can distinguish between a courageous event or a sort of virtuous engagement. No, there's nothing in the hypothesis that fundamental reality is mindless that gives any kind of positive prediction of that. But if instead fundamental reality is supreme in its nature, has maximal value, well, then I have some reason to think that this maximally valuable foundation would be interested in crafting a world in which there are all sorts of interesting experiences, including an experience where we can discern good states of affairs. I mean, that's the kind of thing I would sort of expect to emerge out of a fundamentally good reality. And you might say, well, what about bad state of affairs? How do they fit in? Well, the idea here is that maybe they can all fit into some kind of larger picture that's ultimately good if fundamental reality is good. At least this is open in principle. And so we make an argument from probability that if there are moral senses, these moral senses are more likely if fundamental reality has some kind of mentality than if it's completely mindless.
We can clearly see that the attributes of God that we talk, or the attribute of the necessary being that we were talking about, we can clearly see that that being has to be good, has to be all good, as I established previously, and has to be conscious or aware in this sense. So we see a clear picture of how the necessary being that we were talking about, it slowly resembles or has actually reached to the point where it is almost like the concept of God, minimalistic concept of God, I would still say. We're not going in particulars as of now. So from that perspective, this necessary being clearly has wisdom, power, consciousness, will, awareness, all in the maximal sense. Now, this has many implications. I think what we have established so far has many implications. Now, before I move further and we end the part on God's existence, I just want to highlight what we could have covered, because God's existence is a vast topic. There is so much to cover. So for those who are interested and want to go deeper in these subjects, they can actually access those links and those references, inshallah. Let's start with the explanatory reach of theism. So we might not be able to cover everything so far, but let's cover a few things. So now when we look at reality, so there are so many possible options that people have when they want to explain reality, and if there is a fundamental existence to reality or not. Now, we in our part on God's existence clearly saw the contingency argument makes sense of existence because now we posit a necessary being. Then we move into fine tuning. The fine tuning for life actually points in some sense to the fundamental aspect of reality having some sort of choice. Consciousness does explain that fundamental reality has to be conscious. Mental causation and conceptual space I'm not going to cover in this section because I think those are a bit more complex. People who are interested in these two aspects, they can have a look at my discussion with Dr. Joshua Rasmussen. This was formulated by Dr. Joshua Rasmussen, explaining how theism best explains reality. Theism basically belief in God. Move to moral awareness. We did clearly see that there is some kind of moral awareness that we have, and theism best explains that. Rules of reason I'm not going to cover in this. Again, there's a list of arguments that I could cover, but I don't think we have time to cover this. The natural order is basically, again, what we covered previously in the last episode, idea about how laws themselves, you cannot take them as brute facts. You need an explanation of why you have these kind of coherent and consistent laws across all of the universe. And naturalism, within the worldview of naturalism, it is still unexpected compared to theism, where you have this universe where laws are governed on the universe and the whole universe functions based on these laws. So natural order is also what theism explains. Then there are two new arguments, which I just want to touch on, which Joshua Rasmussen covered in my discussion. because these are very interesting. So I'm going to highlight these two arguments, which again show how theism explains aspects of reality which all of the alternative explanations fail to even account for. So the next one is soul developing experiences. So let's have a look at this one. And then the ninth one you mentioned was soul developing experiences. What would that be?
So yeah, we talked about this in terms of, even conflicts can contribute to greater understanding. And I continually find this out in my relationship with my wife, Rachel, where maybe there's some kind of misunderstanding and then I experience a certain amount of pain from the conflict, but that pain opens up a door to greater understanding on a deep emotional level where it's like, wow, that's so interesting to understand, like how I can connect with you in these ways that I didn't realize. And so there are opportunities to grow that come through the challenge. And so these are soul developing opportunities. And I wouldn't expect that. I mean, just again, you put a TV to a random station where there's no intelligent power behind the station, and you're not going to get any kind of drama just randomly, mindlessly emerging. Like, even if the pixels just randomly form shapes that look like characters, those characters aren't going to actually have experiences and have soul developing experiences. It's just probably not going to happen. I think it's impossible. So since there are soul developing experiences in our world, that seems to be more likely if fundamental reality has some kind of mental reality.
Okay, so we can clearly see now in this particular video, what Dr. Joshua Rasmussen is actually highlighting is this aspect which we come across, which is this aspect of soul developing, where going through pain, going through suffering itself actually develops us, or can be a form of character building, or it can bring out something from within us, like, or change our character, change us in a way. And it can be at good at times, it can be bad at times, but this kind of soul developing itself is something that we see in our lives. Like, if you speak to people like who have sometimes if you speak to people who have like a very good character, and you see that okay, they have gone through pain and that changed them, that developed their character. So you see, going through pain is not completely arbitrary. There could be various reasons why that happened. What one we could see is actually this kind of soul development. Now, if there is something like soul development, that itself would again be unexpected under naturalism compared to theism. Because under a theistic worldview, if you have an all good, if you have a conscious, a wise creator, then you can account better for soul developing experiences than compared to when you have a naturalistic worldview where everything is non-personal, where things are not directed. And this again becomes really unexpected. So I can give you arguments after arguments to drive the point home, but I'm getting at somewhere. So now I'm going to move into the next argument, which we covered. So for example, soul developing experiences is something uniquely theism covers. And then another one is narrative structures. So I'm going to play a video related to that now from Dr. Joshua Rasmussen, because this is a new sort of argument that still is very powerful. So we can cover this now. The 10th one, which you mentioned, is narrative structures. What would that be?
I'm thinking of the story structure that we find in our lives. So you can sort of describe your life as having a story structure. You can describe each day as having a story structure. There's episodes, there's scene transitions, there's plots and characters and developments. History is itself a story of human civilizations and individuals and nations. There's large stories, there's small stories, there's stories inside stories. This is familiar. I mean, I always tell my students, don't mistake the familiar parts of reality for the insignificant parts of reality. Things are so familiar to us that we think that they're not significant because they're familiar. But actually, the things that I would argue, things like thoughts, your own existence, the story structure of our lives, these are very, very significant things. Reality doesn't have to include, if you just take a random conceivable reality, it doesn't have to include stories. You could imagine, I mean, if you want to take an atheistic model, you can imagine an atheistic theory where fundamental reality is just mindless blue dots elements that unfold to produce planets, and that's it. Or even creatures that are unconscious, or even creatures that are conscious, but there's no psychological sequence. Because I mean, we just take for granted that, oh, well, once you get consciousness, well, now we could get every other consciousness. It's like, well, no, I mean, you could have a sequence that is meaningless. Like you could have the feeling of cold next to the image of orange, next to a thought about numbers adding up to ice, just meaningless, silly conscious sequences that aren't organized in the form of a narrative structure at all. And yet here we have psychological sequences organized according to narrative structure. Like, well, why is that? Well, it seems like if fundamental reality is intelligent, then that's going to increase the probability that there's going to be these meaningful story structures in reality. So I think of the story structure as kind of an organization of many other things we talked about. The existence of minds, the existence of matter. It's more than that. It's also the sequence of events. It's a sequencing.
Yeah.
It's a meaningful
I never thought of that.
with psychological drama, that develops our character. And so I think there's a story argument for theism and a story argument for even more particular stories within of God's interaction with us in the world.
This is something I've never come across, and honestly, this is mind-boggling that I never thought of that. Yeah, you can also you talk about the organization of these things, and that could also be an argument. Okay, yeah. So this was my conversation with Dr. Joshua Rasmussen. Which, well, if you are interested, they can have a look at this conversation. I would recommend, in fact, the entire course that Dr. Joshua Rasmussen provided on theism, which has 2 parts, which covers many aspects of theism, which we were not able to cover in this series. But coming back to what he said, okay, it's very insightful. If we look at aspects of reality, and if we look at consciousness itself, we were previously arguing for, what consciousness is and why it is distinct. But when we look at our reality and our lives, it's not just consciousness. It's a particular type of experience that we go through, which actually is in a form of a narrative structure, psychological sequencing of experiences in a narrative structure itself is something that is very remarkable. So what he mentioned is that, we should not mistake in the familiar with the insignificant. Yeah, so this is very significant. It might be familiar to us. We have too familiarized it, but this is not insignificant. This is a significant aspect of reality that if we ponder on how reality itself, or our reality itself, manifests in a narrative structure. Our day itself goes in a narrative structure. There is psychological sequencing in a narrative structure, in a story structure, and our lives are a narrative structure. Combinations of lives is a narrative structure. History itself are stories within stories, like narrative structures within narrative structure, which is a remarkable aspect of reality, which should be, again, very surprising in a naturalism, because under naturalism, even if you get consciousness, which you cannot, but even if you somehow started accounting for consciousness, you still cannot account for psychological sequencing in a narrative structure, because consciousness itself, I mean, as Dr. Joshua Rasmussen highlighted, could have been like experience itself. It's not necessary that every experience has to be in a narrative structure, but experience which is formulated in a narrative structure itself is something that raises huge questions for the worldview of naturalism, for those who think that fundamental reality is completely mindless, because in the end, you cannot account for this aspect of reality. Whereas theism, if we go back to what we were saying, theism accounts for all of these aspects of reality, which puts theism as the most simple and provides the most explanatory scope, the simple, the most comprehensive, unified explanation for reality. Now, I'll say that again, this is what even Joshua Rasmussen agrees on, Robert Kunz agrees on, these are philosophers, and they say that theism is the most simple, comprehensive, unified explanation, because all of these aspects of reality, theism unifies them in a sense, because it grounds them in and unifies them. And it is simple. You don't have to have a very, very complex explanation, because the concept of God in many cases, having these attributes in the maximal sense, is far more simpler than adding limitations to God, which increases complexity. So theism is simple. It is the most comprehensive, because theism provides the most explanatory scope. It accounts for many aspects of reality which alternative explanations fail to account for. And then it is unified because it unifies them. Like for for a non-theist who want to account for this aspect of reality, he might come with ad hoc explanations for this and then this aspect of reality and this aspect of reality. But those are going to remain ad hoc explanations for different aspects of reality. He cannot unify them, and that would and theism would still trump over that kind of an explanation. So this is something that I think everyone, even the deniers of theism, if they actually investigate theism, they have to agree on this fact that theism as an explanation is the most simple, comprehensive, unified explanation for reality. So this is something that I wanted to highlight in this discussion and get you guys to actually come to the conclusion, to actually see for yourself how there is no other worldview that even stands close to theism when you look at it from an explanatory scope perspective, a unified perspective, and a simple perspective. This makes theism clearly unique and actually a worldview which you can't deny. Then there are other aspects which I don't want this conversation to be then cover that as well. But if you ponder on other aspects of reality, our normal functioning as human beings itself, if you look at it, like, our striving for meaning, our striving for purpose, our striving for some kind of moral obligation or moral ought, these things itself, theism makes more sense of that. So now another aspect of theism that I want to highlight is what we could have covered and what we have covered so far, just for you guys to actually have more resources if you guys want to go deeper into the subject. So what we have covered is a version of the contingency argument so far. Kalam cosmological argument we did not cover yet, but we did when we were highlighting will. The will of God, we did actually bring out some second stage arguments within the Kalam cosmological argument. Then we covered family of arguments within part one for God's existence and part two of God's existence. And this part I'm talking about all of them. We covered family of design arguments and fine tuning argument. We covered nomenological arguments, argument from nomenological harmony, the applicability of mathematics, arguments from purpose and function. This is what we covered. In today's discussion, we did cover consciousness, objective morality, soul developing experiences, and narrative structures. Now, if we had to cover more, we could have covered argument from reason. And I'm going to give you some sources which, like, these are also arguments that can help to build a case for theism. There is another argument known as positive epistemic status. I had this on my channel. This argument presented by Dr. Justin Barrett. Argument from beauty and aesthetics. I have created a few posts on it. You can have a look at it. There is something known as argument from truth itself. Brother Jake, the Muslim metaphysician, he provides explains these kind of arguments. There's one thing known as psychophysical harmony. I did not cover this argument because, again, it's a complex topic, but I have this post which covers this argument. Argument from language, I have an entire 2-part series on this. It's a family of arguments. It's pretty interesting. You can cover this. Argument from prior cognitive information. This is something what Dr. Shahrukh Chaudhary actually addresses. This is a very interesting argument. You can have a look at it. Argument from common consent. This was covered by Matthew Braddock. I think it's very interesting. You guys can have a look at this one as well. Now, from a fitri perspective, another aspect that I want to cover is that, or I wanted to cover, but I don't have time in this conversation, is that the existence of God itself, in some sense, can be argued to be a properly basic belief, a self-evident truth. Because you see many aspects, many things within our cognitive system, they are automatically delivered and they are considered the norm and you accept them as the default. When it comes to God's existence, we have a natural tendency to accept God. Generally, human beings have we have this natural tendency to accept God's existence. Even without cultural indoctrination, you would still come or have some idea of this concept of even with people who don't believe in religion, they say that there's some kind of power, etc., etc. Why do they say that? Because we have this natural disposition to believe in God. There's a lot of evidence from cognitive science that highlights this. I have some videos on this as well, which is a interesting aspect, which again is a challenge for naturalism, because human beings being obsessed with this concept and having a natural disposition which drives us or makes it more likely for us, even non-inferentially, which means without reasoning, you come to this concept, you start believing in, or you have some idea of God which you're naturally inclined to have, is something unexpected under naturalism, or is hard. It's at least harder to explain under naturalism compared to theism. Because from a theist, for a theist, it is very well expected why people would have this kind of natural inclination. And of course, I'm not going to go deep into these studies. I'm just going to highlight some of my videos that cover this. In fact, I had an entire series on the fitra. You guys can actually have a look at the entire series if you find this useful. Then if someone's interested in these kind of fitri perspectives for God's existence, which actually highlight in some sense that God, like, proving God's existence actually is not always necessary. Like, in many cases, you can, if you if you understand that belief in God is the default, you don't need to provide evidence for the default. Rather, someone who's trying to deny the default or is trying to counter the default, they have the burden of proof. From this perspective, from this kind of epistemological perspective, they have the burden of proof to actually give us some reasons why we need to override the default, which I think people make attempts but fail miserably. So from this perspective, I think one article by Asadul Ali Al-Andrusi is a very good read. You can also watch my video with James Kelly Clark on this, and we also talk about his book. His book is also something very interesting, which you guys can read and get more insights on this aspect. You can also read like this article by Dr. Nasir Khan on radical skepticism. Again, goes back to highlighting the idea of belief in God is the default. And there are some works of Jamie Turner as well, which again get us back to this idea. Now let me see if I had more to cover in this. So these are some arguments and some resources that a person can actually go through and see. Now, there are some arguments that actually are, in some sense, internal critiques for atheism. So there are some evolutionary debunking arguments that show how atheism in itself becomes a self-defeating position. So I can provide some resources for this side as well, because atheism becomes self-defeating in many different ways, and this itself can be a way to establish theism. So one is an evolutionary debunking argument, or list of evolutionary debunking argument that you can go through. Another way is actually how Dr. Joshua Rasmussen highlights two ways where evolution contradicts itself. These two ways also I can highlight on the screen, and this can also be a nice resource. In conclusion, what I wanted to highlight is that there is theism as a worldview. There is so much that we can talk about, what we can discuss. But since this series, I don't want this entire series to be just narrowing down to theism and atheism, or like debates between theism and atheism. We can at least, so far from what we have covered so far, we can at least come to this conclusion that yes, theism trumps over all of its alternative. And this is something we can very well establish via a number of different arguments. In fact, there are some versions of argument known as cumulative case arguments, which make a cumulative case for theism. When you look at all of these arguments and all of the evidence that we have, and if you try to put all of this together, you see we have a very powerful cumulative case for theism. And this makes theism, to a point where you can it's very hard for you to deny, and it becomes very hard for you to deny theism and choose an alternative for theism and still be grounded in reason. So from this perspective, I think we can conclude our series on God's existence. We see that there is very strong, powerful evidence for us to believe in a God. Now, there might be some nuances we did not deal with, but coming back to where we were, we have clearly established theism as the best explanation of reality, and we've seen how many of its alternatives turn out to be inadequate. And to this, I just want to bring up one more thing. Philosopher Robert Kroon's, was actually discussing in one video something very interesting. He was saying that theism is inevitable. He was implying that if you want a coherent worldview, theism is required. His statement was that theism is required for a coherent worldview. So those who are interested to have a coherent worldview, I think theism becomes inevitable at this point. And with that, I would say this inevitable aspect of theism can lead us to conclude our series on God's existence. And in the next episode, inshallah ta'ala, we would have Brother Yusuf Ponder back on our channel, and we would cover the O of GORAPS, inshallah. So the G of GORAPS, we can at least end on the G of GORAPS and move on, inshallah, in the next episode to the O of GORAPS, which would be oneness of God. And I have some very interesting new arguments to bring in, including all of the most old, powerful ones. And inshallah, I would love to see you guys again. See you soon. Jazakallah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.